What happens when the one they tried to break becomes the one they fear? Why did the pastor's wife confess her forbidden desire and vanish days later? And who was Lisette, the girl no one remembers, but no one can forget? Some stories are buried, others refuse to stay silent. This is one of them. If you want more stories like this one, forgotten, silenced, and those we should never forget, subscribe to the channel. The next case might already be knocking at your door. Sombra Roterista dice, under the blistering sun of a late spring afternoon in 1860, the soil of Georgia drank the sweat and blood of those bound to it by chains and scripture. Willow Creek Plantation, with its columns of whitewashed pride and fields of cotton stretching like an ocean of thorns, stood in still defiance of time and mercy. The master of the house, Reverend Elias Whitlow, was a man of sharp sermons and dull compassion. His wife, Margaret, remained a figure of mystery and melancholy, seldom seen beyond the draped windows of the manor's upper floor. It was on such a day that Amalie arrived. She came not by her own will, but in the bed of a wooden cart lined with burlap sacks and iron shackles, her wrists still bearing the marks of a journey begun months before in Charleston. Her name had been called only once by a clerk at the auction yard, who mispronounced it before scribbling it onto a ledger. To the white eyes at Willow Creek, she was simply the new girl. To herself, she was still Amalie, a name meaning the beautiful one, in the tongue of her stolen past. At the manor's rear entrance, she was received without words. A thick-set housemaid, Ruth, motioned for her to enter, her eyes offering neither welcome nor warning. Inside, the house breathed coldness, high ceilings, dark wood, and the stale scent of lavender and damp paper. Amalie was led upstairs, her bare feet silent against polished floors, to the quarters of the mistress. Margaret Whitlow sat in a high-backed chair beside the window, dressed in gray silk that looked almost like mourning. Her hands, pale and restless, played with a silver locket she never opened. Her gaze moved slowly toward Amalie and rested there too long. It was not inspection nor curiosity. It was something else, quieter, hungrier. She dismissed Ruth with a gesture and beckoned the girl closer. "You are to serve me directly," she said, her voice soft, lips barely moving. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will remain in my quarters when not attending chores. Do you understand?" Amalie nodded once. Her silence was not fear, but calculation. She had learned to measure every glance, every pause, every breath. Margaret's eyes narrowed, as if expecting resistance. Finding none, she seemed almost disappointed. Then, with a sudden movement, she took Amalie's hand in her own, too gently, as though afraid it might vanish. "Your skin is warm," she murmured, "like fire held in cloth." Amalie did not move. The days that followed passed in a strange hush. Margaret insisted on dressing herself, but required Amalie to brush her hair each morning, stroke by slow stroke. She requested lullabies in a language Amalie refused to sing. She stared long at her servant's reflection in the mirror, often longer than she did her own. At meals, she spoke to no one. Reverend Whitlow ate in silence, reading scripture aloud to himself, as if to keep demons at bay. The master's sermons on Sundays grew harsher, filled with warnings of carnal sin and divine retribution. Parishioners noticed the edge in his voice, but dared not question it. They did not see the red marks on Margaret's wrists, nor the whispers that passed like wind through the house after midnight. Amalie began to explore the manor with caution, noting its creaking floorboards, its locked doors, and a disused piano room filled with dust and portraits whose eyes never quite looked away. In one of the lower cupboards, hidden behind linen, she found a single page of writing, unfamiliar yet oddly precise. A passage copied from the book of Leviticus, annotated in a woman's hand, "And she shall be unclean, but still beloved." One evening, as lightning bruised the sky beyond the plantation fields, Margaret stood at the foot of Amalie's cot and watched her sleep. When Amalie stirred, she pretended not to notice, but her breath caught the scent of lavender and something else beneath it, salt, perhaps, or fear. From the cracked ceiling above, dust fell like ash. The silence of Willow Creek had begun to tremble. Under the veil of early morning mist, the routine of Willow Creek stirred to life, monotonous, ritualistic, and grim. The crack of the overseer's whip echoed across the cotton fields before the sun had fully risen, and the enslaved moved like shadows through the rows. Within the house, however, time flowed differently. Days passed not in labor, but in tension, taut and quiet, like the string of a bow drawn back, waiting to release. Amal remained in the upper quarters of the manor, attending to Margaret Whitlow as instructed. The mistress spoke in whispers, rarely above a murmur, her words curling through the air like smoke. She often read aloud from tattered books of poetry and obscure religious tracts, her fingers tracing the lines as if trying to summon meaning from them. Sometimes she stopped mid-sentence to study Amali's face, not with cruelty or superiority, but with something else, more elusive, possession, perhaps, or longing. There was no clarity in Margaret's gaze, only an aching softness that seemed to fray at the edges, and beneath it, a quiet desperation that unnerved even the seasoned servants. She began to keep Amale close at all hours, during meals, during prayer, even while she slept. The cot in the corner of the mistress's room, once untouched, now bore Amali's weight each night. Margaret claimed she feared being alone, but her glances betrayed a more complex solitude. On the third Sunday after Amali's arrival, Margaret refused to attend church. Her absence was noted, but not questioned. Reverend Whitlow preached with heightened fury, invoking Sodom and the whore of Babylon in the same breath, his voice trembling with veiled wrath. That evening, the master and mistress dined in silence. Margaret barely touched her food, and Amali, standing by the wall, felt the man's gaze flicker toward her with suspicion sharpened by something unspoken. Later that night, Margaret took Amali by the hand and led her through the darkened halls of the house to a small, locked room at the end of the west wing. She held the key tight in her palm, as though its shape had been burned into her skin. Inside, the room smelled of dust and rosewater. It was filled with objects that had no place in a pastor's home: carved figures from West Africa, jars sealed with wax and strange symbols, bundles of dried herbs tied with red string. "These were my mother's," Margaret said. "She was touched by something foreign, something your people brought here long ago." Amale said nothing, but her breath slowed. The air in the room felt thicker, as if history itself hung suspended within it. Margaret knelt before a low altar and traced her fingers along its edges. "She used to speak in tongues when the fever came," Margaret continued, "and she would ask for someone with skin like yours. She said they could open the veil." Amali took a step back, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Whatever illness haunted the house had not begun with Margaret, but had passed through her, inherited like fine silver and quiet madness, and now it sought a vessel. That night, Margaret asked to be sung to sleep. "Something in your language," she said, her voice cracking. Amali refused. The next morning, a scrawled note was found beside the mistress's bed. It was torn from a Bible page, with a single sentence underlined 3 times, "And she shall cleave unto her handmaid." Servants began to whisper. The house grew colder, and in the corners where no light reached, something began to stir. The weather turned sour in the weeks that followed, as if the land itself mirrored the unease festering inside Willow Creek. Rain fell in steady sheets, turning the fields to sludge and muting the plantation's rhythms into a dull, oppressive silence. The air hung thick with moisture and rumor. Something was changing in the house, something that could not be named aloud. Margaret's behavior grew erratic. She wandered barefoot through the hallways at night, whispering to unseen presences. She no longer dined with her husband. When Reverend Whitlow tried to speak to her, she responded with laughter, sharp and hollow, like a cracked bell. The other house servants avoided her completely now, crossing themselves in secret when her name was spoken. Amali, bound by proximity and silence, remained the one constant at Margaret's side, the reluctant witness to her unraveling. One afternoon, as thunder rumbled over the plantation, Margaret pressed a folded paper into Amali's hand. Her fingers trembled as she did so, but her eyes burned with sudden clarity. "Read it," she said, before retreating to her chamber and locking the door behind her. Amali waited until nightfall to open it. Inside, written in a tight, slanted hand, was a passage, not from Scripture, but from Margaret's own thoughts. I have felt something move beneath my skin since the night she arrived. It is not sin nor sickness. It is a knowing, terrible and sweet. When she looks at me, I remember who I was before this marriage, before the sermons, before my soul became a prison. I want her to see me. I want her to forgive me. The paper smelled faintly of rose and smoke. Amal folded it once more and hid it beneath a loose floorboard beneath her cot. She had read the desires of masters before, in their eyes, their gestures, their violence. But this was different. Margaret's longing had no shape, no plan. It was wild and infantile, a hunger born not of power, but of despair. The next evening, Margaret asked Amale to join her in the abandoned root cellar behind the house, a place once used to store potatoes and salted meat, now cold and empty. She carried with her a small bundle wrapped in cloth, candles, a worn Bible, and a piece of chalk. Amala hesitated at the threshold, but followed. The mistress lit the candles one by one, placing them in a circle. "My mother said we are not born wicked," she whispered, "only made so by the hands of men." She knelt and began to murmur in a half-language, part scripture, part mimicry of something older. She drew symbols on the ground that made Amali's chest tighten, not from fear, but from memory. These were shapes she had seen once, drawn by the elders back home, warnings carved into tree bark, spoken of only in drought or sickness. Margaret reached for Amali's hand. "You can save me," she said, "or curse me. I will not resist either." Amal did not move. Her face gave nothing away. The ritual ended when the candles burned low. Margaret wept quietly, her head on Amal's lap, whispering her name like a plea, like a hymn. When they returned to the house, Amali's fingers smelled of wax and blood. 3 days later, Amali found a locked drawer in Margaret's writing desk, slightly ajar. Inside, beneath scraps of torn fabric and yellowing pages, lay a second journal, not of prayers or dreams, but of confessions. It detailed, in vivid language, Margaret's growing obsession with Amale, of dreams where their bodies intertwined, of guilt sharpened into ecstasy. But darker still were the entries about the other girls, the ones who had come before, servants who vanished without explanation. And a final line, repeated over and over in a hand that grew shakier with each line: "She is the last, she must be." The house had secrets, and now, so did Amali. Whispers filled the manor like smoke through old wood, slow, suffocating, and impossible to trace. The servants knew not to speak openly, but their silence became its own language. Margaret Whitlow was unraveling, and something unnatural tethered her to the girl from Charleston. The Reverend, once a pillar of righteousness, had begun pacing at night with a pistol tucked in his Bible and sweat pooling at the collar of his shirt. He had stopped preaching altogether, claiming illness, though his eyes betrayed something closer to dread. Amala moved through the house like a ghost bound by duty. She spoke little, but saw much. The way Margaret's hands shook as she lit her candles, the way she kept a lock of Amali's hair in a glass vial beside her bedside cross, and the way the mistress stared into mirrors as if trying to see through them, not into her reflection, but into something beyond. One night, a violent storm broke over Willow Creek. Thunder cracked like the voice of judgment, and rain pounded the fields into pulp. Amid the chaos, Margaret appeared at Amal's cot in her nightgown, soaked to the bone. Her eyes were wild. "She's calling for me," she whispered, voice brittle. "Mama, I hear her singing through the walls. I remember her hands, her voice in the garden, the things she told me not to tell Father, but she's here now, watching me through your skin." Amali said nothing. Margaret knelt on the floor and gripped her servant's hands with white knuckles. "You have to take it away. Whatever she left in me. I can't bear it anymore. I can't—" A sharp knock at the door silenced her. Reverend Whitlow stood at the threshold, rain trailing from the brim of his hat. "You'll return to your room," he told his wife. His voice was flat, final. Margaret did not move. "She's not yours," he added, glancing at Amali with contempt, thinly veiled as piety. "And she will not save you." The next morning, Amali was ordered to leave the main house. Her place, the Reverend declared, was in the quarters behind the chapel, the same ones where the previous housegirls had stayed. None had lasted long. Some had fled, others had simply vanished. The quarters were sparse: a narrow bed, a basin, a shelf of discarded Bibles. But behind a loose panel in the floor, Amalie found remnants of the ones who came before: a torn ribbon, a rosary without a cross, and a diary too damaged by damp to read, save for a single phrase repeated on the last page: "She kissed me, and then I woke in the dark." That night, Margaret sent a letter. It was smuggled through Ruth, sealed in red wax and smelling faintly of lavender and vinegar. Inside were only 2 lines, written in haste: "Come back. I need to show you what he's hidden, what he did to her." Beneath it was a name Amalie had never seen before: Lisette. She burned the letter after reading it 3 times. 2 days later, a servant boy was found in the well behind the chapel. No one knew how he got there. The Reverend claimed suicide, though the boy had no family to grieve him. Margaret was not seen for 3 more days. Then, without warning, she reappeared in the chapel during evening prayer, barefoot and silent, her eyes rimmed in red. She walked up the aisle, stopped before her husband at the altar, and turned to the congregation. Her voice, when it came, was clear and deliberate. "I desired her," she said, "as I was never allowed to desire anything." Gasps rippled through the room. The Reverend rose, livid, but Margaret lifted her hand to silence him. "I loved her," she continued, "and I am not ashamed." She turned, left the chapel, and disappeared into the storm that had begun to gather once more. The next morning, Margaret Whitlow was nowhere to be found, but Amalie awoke to the smell of smoke and a smear of ash beneath her door. The ash beneath the door smudged beneath Amalie's bare foot as she rose, and the air carried the scent of something burned but not entirely gone. Smoke, yes, but also wax, old paper, and something sweeter, like dried herbs or perfume faded by time. Outside, the plantation stirred in hesitant silence. No bells rang, no orders were shouted. The chapel stood still as a tomb, its door ajar. Margaret Whitlow was gone. Amal dressed in silence and stepped into the morning light. Clouds rolled low and fast across the sky, casting the fields in a bruised hue. The slaves moved slower than usual, their glances cautious. News of the mistress's confession had traveled like disease, twisted by fear, softened by pity, but preserved in its essence. Margaret had spoken a truth too loud for this place, and now she had vanished into it. Inside the manor, the Reverend moved like a ghost with a loaded spine. He barked orders with brittle urgency, demanding order, control, silence. The servants avoided his gaze. Amalie was summoned back to the main house with no explanation, and this time, no one questioned her presence. She returned not as a servant, but as something else, an unanswered question that no one dared to ask again. The house had changed. In the parlor, a large oil painting of the Whitlow family had been removed. In its place hung a black cloth. The doors to Margaret's room were locked. But Amalie noticed something new, the smell of soil and rain lingering around the seams of the door, as if something had been unearthed and left behind. 3 nights later, Amalie heard the voice. It came from beneath the floorboards, not loud, not desperate, just present. It was a child's voice, reciting verses not found in scripture. She pressed her ear to the boards and heard the rhythm. 4 words, repeated like a chant, in a dialect she hadn't spoken since the ships. She whispered the final word aloud, and the voice fell silent. At dawn, Ruth appeared with an envelope. No seal, no sender. Inside was a folded map of the manor grounds, drawn in haste, marked with a single red X behind the chapel. Beneath it, scribbled in a trembling hand, were 4 words: "Lisette is still there." Amalie waited until nightfall. She slipped out through the back garden, past the jasmine and the neglected roses, through the wet grass to the rear of the chapel. There, behind the vines and crumbling stone, she found a trapdoor she had never noticed before. Small, iron-rimmed, nearly rusted shut. With both hands, she pulled it open. A narrow staircase led into the earth. She descended with nothing but a match and the memory of Margaret's voice. The air grew colder with each step, until she reached a chamber no larger than a cellar. Inside were shelves of books, jars of preserved flowers, and a broken rocking chair. On the far wall, carved into the brick, was the name Lisette, over and over, in a child's careful script, as if practicing for someone who would never answer. On the floor lay a small, rotted doll, its hair singed at the ends, and in the center of the room, resting atop a slab of stone, was a journal bound in skin-soft leather. Amalie opened it. It belonged to Margaret, but the entries were older, frantic, incomplete. They spoke of a girl named Lisette, an orphan purchased for the house, adored by Margaret, hated by her father. The entries ended abruptly after one last passage. "He found us, said she bewitched me. Took her down here, said he would cleanse her. I heard her scream for 3 days, then nothing." The last page was stained. As Amalie turned to leave, she felt the temperature shift. The air pressed against her skin like breath. Behind her, a faint creak, wood on stone, or perhaps something older moving after too long still. She didn't look back. She climbed the stairs, sealed the door, and walked calmly into the night. The truth had been buried, but not forgotten, and now it had a witness. For 3 days after descending into the chapel's hidden vault, Amalie spoke to no one. She returned to her duties in silence, her eyes lowered, her hands steady, her movements precise. But within her, something had shifted, not broken, but realigned. She now carried a weight that did not belong to her, yet could not be passed on. The house, too, had gone quieter, not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes before a reckoning. The Reverend noticed. His sermons resumed, but they were fevered, disjointed, filled with fire and pestilence, delivered with a voice too loud for the chapel's cracked walls. He glared at Amalie when she entered to clean, but never spoke to her directly. Once, she caught him muttering her name under his breath, followed by a verse about Jezebel and damnation. The servants kept their distance. Rumors had taken root, that Amalie had cursed the mistress, that she had walked among the dead, that her shadow flickered where it should not, yet none dared confront her. There was something in her stillness that commanded more than fear. It demanded respect, or perhaps caution. One night, as wind battered the shutters and trees clawed at the windows, Ruth entered Amalie's room without knocking. She held a bundle wrapped in cloth, her face pale and tight. "He's sending you away," Ruth whispered. "Charleston. Says the devil rides your breath." Amalie didn't flinch. "When?" "Tomorrow. He's hired a driver. Says it's for your safety. But we know better." Amalie reached beneath her bed and pulled out Margaret's journal. She unwrapped it slowly, as one might uncover a wound, and placed it into Ruth's hands. "Keep it," she said. "If I do not return, burn the house before you read it." The next morning, the wagon waited by the gate. The Reverend stood on the porch, his eyes sunken, a pistol barely concealed beneath his coat. He gave no farewell. Amalie climbed into the wagon and did not look back. The road to Charleston was long and sodden, cutting through trees bowed by moss and time. The driver did not speak. Amalie closed her eyes and listened to the wheels groan beneath her, like bones under strain. At dusk, the wagon stopped at a river crossing. The driver stepped down, claiming the horses needed rest. Amalie used the moment to slip into the woods. She did not run. She walked slowly, deliberately, until the trees closed behind her and the road disappeared. She spent the night beneath a canopy of stars, listening to the insects chant their warnings. She had no plan, only clarity. The Reverend feared her not because of what she had done, but because of what she knew and what she was capable of becoming. By morning, she had made her way back to Willow Creek. She entered through the kitchen door. No one saw her. The house creaked in recognition. She went directly to the chapel. Inside, she found the Reverend alone, kneeling before the altar, muttering scripture as if to drown out his own heartbeat. He looked up, startled, and his mouth fell open, not in surprise, but in resignation. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse. Amalie stepped forward. "She was never sick," she said. "You made her believe she was. You made her watch. Then you made her forget." He rose, hand moving toward the pistol beneath his coat. "She loved her," Amalie said, "and that made her dangerous." The Reverend's hand froze. Amalie stepped closer. "And you? What did you do to Lisette?" His face twisted. "She was a curse. Like you. Like all of them." Amalie reached into her coat and held out the doll, the one from beneath the chapel. The Reverend stared, his skin turning waxen. "She screamed for 3 days," Amali said softly. "You wrote it yourself." He stepped back, trembling. "You don't know what you're—" But she did. The candles on the altar flickered violently, though no wind stirred. Outside, the first shovel of dirt was lifted from Margaret's garden. The garden behind the Whitlow Manor had long been a place of contradictions. Roses grown beside thorns, lilies wilting in the shadow of overgrown hedges. Margaret had once tended it with obsessive care, her hands always stained with soil, her skirts perpetually damp with morning dew. She had spoken to the flowers, whispered their names like secrets. Now, the garden had grown wild in her absence, overtaken by vines and silence. But Amali knew where to dig. Beneath the third stone from the fountain, under roots that curled like veins through clay, she found the box. It was iron-bound and no larger than a bread loaf, sealed in wax and wrapped in what once had been a child's blanket. Amali lifted it with both hands, her breath shallow. The weight was not physical. It pressed on her chest like memory. She carried it to the chapel, where the Reverend still stood, frozen before the altar. When he saw the box, he recoiled. "No," he whispered. "That was dealt with. It was sanctified." Amali said nothing. She placed the box on the steps and broke the seal with the tip of a rusted nail. The lid creaked open. Inside lay the remains of a child's journal, half burned, the pages blackened at the edges, but the center preserved. The handwriting was small, hesitant. The entries began like any child's, full of simple joys and names of birds, but they turned, slowly, into something darker. Descriptions of locked doors, of voices in the night, of a woman's cries through the walls. "Miss Margaret says she will protect me, but he watches when I sleep." Amali turned a page. The final entry was written in shaking lines. "If I am not here tomorrow, tell Mama I tried to be good." The Reverend staggered back, as if struck. "She lied to you," he hissed. "That child was sick, touched by something wicked." Amali stood over the journal. Her voice was steady. "You killed her." "I saved her," he shouted. "I cleansed her of sin. I buried her shame so Margaret wouldn't be defiled by it." He fell to his knees, trembling. "I did it for the family, for the church." Amali stepped closer. "There is no church left." The chapel's walls groaned. The candles on the altar flickered, though the air remained still. The air smelled of rain again, and of iron. Outside, the plantation stirred. Ruth watched from a distance, the other servants standing behind her, their faces solemn. None stepped forward. None interfered. Inside, Amali reached down and took the Reverend's hand. He flinched, but did not resist. She guided him to the garden. He stumbled, silent, as if led by the dead. There, beside the open earth, Amali handed him the child's journal. "You will read it," she said, "every word, and then you will dig." He looked at her with something like hatred, something like recognition, but he took the shovel. By nightfall, he had unearthed what he had buried: bones wrapped in lace, a doll with no eyes, a lock of hair tied in twine, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was waiting. That night, no one slept at Willow Creek. The house creaked with the weight of what had been uncovered. The earth in the garden, newly turned, emitted a sour odor, not only of decay, but of secrets too long buried. The Reverend sat alone by the grave, his clothes soiled, his eyes vacant. He did not weep, he did not pray, he simply sat, as if listening for a voice that would never speak to him again. Amali stood in the doorway of the chapel, her arms crossed over her chest. She watched him until the sky paled with dawn. Then she turned and entered the house one last time. Margaret's room was unlocked. The air was stale, untouched for days. Dust danced in the corners. The bed remained neatly made, but a faint outline in the mattress betrayed where someone had once curled into themselves. The vanity mirror was cracked, and the drawer that had once held the locket now lay open and empty. Amal moved with purpose. She opened the wardrobe and pulled out the books Margaret had hidden, volumes of folklore, natural remedies, and half-burned pages of letters never sent. Among them, folded carefully into the lining of a shawl, she found the final page of Margaret's second journal. The handwriting was different, less composed, as though written in haste. "I saw her, in the garden. She was not afraid. She looked like Lisette, like me. I think I loved her because she reminded me of something I could have been. If I am gone, it is not because I fled, it is because I refused to be remade. Amala read the passage 3 times, then folded it and placed it in her pocket. She took nothing else. She left the manor through the front door. No one stopped her. The overseer had vanished sometime in the night. The other white staff followed suit by morning. Only the enslaved remained, standing in quiet clusters, eyes following her as she crossed the yard, not out of suspicion, but acknowledgement. By sundown, the Reverend was dead. They found him at the foot of the grave, the child's journal pressed to his chest, no sign of struggle, no wound upon his body, just the look of someone who had finally been seen and could not bear it. The next days passed in slow dissolution. Willow Creek no longer had a master. The church door remained barred. The chapel bell never rang again. A fire started in the east wing of the house 2 weeks later, though no one claimed to have seen who lit it. The flames consumed the parlor and Margaret's room. The garden, untouched by fire, bloomed violently that spring. Amala was last seen boarding a wagon headed north. She left with no papers, no possessions, only a folded page and a name that was never recorded on any census. In time, the stories changed. Some said she was a witch, others an angel of vengeance. But among those who remained, those who had borne witness to the silence, the sickness, the slow rot of the Whitlow name, she became something else entirely. A reckoning, quiet, patient, righteous. And in the ruins of the chapel, if one stands long enough after dusk, they say you can still hear the soft hum of a hymn never written, sung in a tongue no longer spoken, not a curse, not a prayer, a remembrance. Years passed, and the land forgot its own name. The map-makers redrew the lines of Georgia, and Willow Creek vanished from records, swallowed by vines, by silence, by the kind of decay that begins not with rot, but with memory itself. What remained of the plantation became a cautionary tale passed between generations of field hands and wandering preachers, always whispered, never written, but some things resist forgetting. In 1890, long after the war had ground its way through the South and left behind only ghosts and scorched earth, a group of surveyors was sent to assess the old Whitlow estate. The land had been dormant for decades. Trees had taken root in the parlor. The chapel roof had collapsed inward, forming a skeletal crown of beams, and yet the garden remained impossibly alive. Roses bloomed in thick, tangled bursts. Wild herbs sprang from stone, and lilies grew in clusters around a single mound of earth no one dared disturb. One of the men, a young cartographer with northern eyes, found something beneath a floor tile in the chapel, a sealed envelope, yellowed by time and moisture. Inside was a page torn from a Bible and a single sentence written in charcoal. The root does not forget the hand that buried it. He asked the others if they knew what it meant. None answered. That night, the team made camp far from the ruins. Stories began to circulate again of a woman seen walking at dusk along the tree line, tall, dark-skinned, wearing a white dress that never touched the ground. Of voices in the chapel ruins, not cries, but songs, melodies older than the land itself, filled with grief and warning. Children from nearby farms claimed to see dolls hanging from branches near the old well, their eyes missing, their limbs bound with red twine. No one returned to live on the land. In a Charleston archive, a ledger was discovered during restoration efforts. It listed property transfers, indentured servitudes, manumissions. One entry stood out, a single name, Amale, followed by a note in the margins, written in unfamiliar handwriting, not sold, not freed, departed. Beside the note was a symbol no one could identify, not a letter, but a mark. It resembled a spiral struck through by a line, as if to seal something in or keep something out. Years later, a historian piecing together accounts of Southern plantations during the final decades of slavery came upon a cluster of names all connected to Willow Creek. Margaret Whitlow, Reverend Elias, Lisette, Amala. He tried to trace their stories, but every document ended in blank pages. Every trail led to silence. He found only one surviving witness, a woman near 90, blind, living in a cottage at the edge of where the estate once stood. She had been a child there, she said. She remembered the songs. She remembered the fire. When asked about Amali, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the chapel ruins. She buried him, she whispered, with the others, but not in the ground, in the place where memory goes when it won't be spoken. And then she said something in a language the historian could not identify. He recorded the sound, played it back dozens of times, but each time it seemed to shift as if it refused to be captured, like a voice still moving through the trees. The land remains untouched to this day. Birds do not nest in the chapel walls. No cotton grows in the soil. But at night, when the wind is still, the air carries a scent, not of rot, nor of ash, but of jasmine and something older, something waiting. In the year 1923, a letter arrived at the office of a university in Savannah. It was unsigned, written in a fine but trembling hand, and postmarked from a town that no longer existed. The envelope contained a single item, a photograph. The image was faded, the edges curled, the surface cracked with age. It showed two women standing in front of a stone fountain overrun by ivy. One was clearly Margaret Whitlow, young and unsmiling, her posture rigid, her hands clasped at her waist. Beside her stood a young black woman in a plain white dress, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The photo bore no date, no studio stamp. Only one word was written on the back: remember. The letter found its way into the hands of a professor of folklore, who kept it locked in a drawer for years, unsure what to make of it. It resurfaced in the 1950s during an archive purge and was quietly donated to a private collection focused on Southern hauntings and regional myths. But those who held the photograph often reported strange dreams. Some claimed they heard humming in their sleep. Others swore they saw the image shift ever so slightly when the room fell quiet. The most persistent story was of a child who touched the photograph and spoke, in a voice not her own, the name Lisette. No record has ever been found of a girl by that name connected to the Whitlow family. No gravestone, no census mention. And yet, in every version of the story that now circulates, in books, in whispers, in late-night radio shows, her name remains central. There are those who say the plantation never truly burned, that it folded into itself like a dying star, leaving behind only echoes and ash. Others believe Amali lived long after the fall of Willow Creek, taking on new names in new cities, passing from one life to the next, like a ripple across water. They say she never aged, that she knew things about people she'd never met, that her hands smelled of jasmine and wax. One account tells of a nurse in New Orleans who once treated a woman in her 90s, near death, with no family and no name. Before she passed, she clutched the nurse's hand and whispered a lullaby in a language the nurse didn't recognize. When asked what it meant, the woman replied, "It's for the child in the ground. She still dreams." The woman died that night. Her eyes were open. Her mouth was smiling. No identification was ever found. Only a small carved pendant beneath her pillow, a spiral struck through by a line. In the decades since, nothing has grown on the land where Willow Creek once stood. Efforts to rebuild have failed. Machinery breaks. Workers leave. The foundations of the manor remain buried beneath moss and soil, resisting excavation. But occasionally, someone reports seeing two figures near the garden fountain, one in white silk, one in cotton, standing together, still, watching. They do not speak, they do not move, and when approached, they vanish, as if swallowed by the silence that once lived in the walls of a house built on lies. The locals call them the Remnant and the Reckoner, but the old ones, the few who remember the songs sung in secret and the names never spoken aloud, call them something else entirely: justice and memory.